In 1977, George Lucas's epic sci-fi saga Star Wars was released in theaters, becoming an unexpected global phenomenon. 4 years earlier, Lucas had crafted a rough outline titled The Journey of the Wills, which served as the foundation for his Star Wars story. In his outline, the protagonist, named Chewie, served as a Padawan, or squire, of a Jedi Master named Mace Windu, later renamed Mace Windu. Chewie trained under this master to become a Jedi Templar. Before the heroes of Star Wars were known as Jedi Knights, they were called Jedi Templars, based on the famous Knights Templar. And while the Templars were real and the Jedi are a creation of fiction, I'd guess many more people know the history of the Jedi. Of course, it doesn't help that the Knights Templar have often been mischaracterized in books and movies. In this episode, I'll trek through the history of the Templars, separate fact from fiction, and illuminate the similarities between them and the Jedi who they inspired.
God bless America.
God love you. I want these to be my first words of greeting to you. They will be the concluding words on each broadcast.
I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president.
Annuncio optis gaudium magnum. Habemus Papam.
You've embarked on a Catholic history trek.
In the mid-6th century, the Byzantine Empire encompassed much of the old Roman Empire, missing only Hispania, Gaul, Germania, and Britannia, basically Spain, France, Germany, and Britain. But with the rise and expansion of the militant Mohammedans, the Byzantine Empire lost North Africa, the Holy Land, and much of Asia Minor, and by the end of the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks were pressing upon the remnants of the empire. Emperor Alexios Komnenos pleaded with the West, including Pope Urban II, for a mercenary army to aid him. What made this request particularly interesting is that it came only a few decades after the eastern half of the Catholic Church had gone into schism, forming the Orthodox churches. Emperor Alexios, who was a vigorous supporter of this schism, and who had been excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII only a few years earlier, was now appealing to Pope Urban II for military assistance. Pope Urban II was no stranger to interesting situations. Having begun his ecclesial life as a monk at the famed Abbey of Cluny, he was pulled from his monastic life to be thrown into the world of political conflict and church reform, before being elected to the papacy. After being elected pope, Urban II spent most of his first 4 years in exile, as Rome was under the control of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, who had used his military might to place anti-Pope Clement III in the seat of Peter. The rest of Europe was no better off than Rome. As described in episode 70 on the banning of the crossbow, 11th century Europe was overrun by a mess of private wars, with armed bands of desperadoes and brigands killing at will and sparing not even holy sanctuaries. Pope Urban II could have ignored the emperor's request, or simply replied no. He did have plenty of issues in the West which demanded his attention, and the emperor was promoting a schism. So, what did the Pope do? In 1054, he called a council at Clermont, at which he passionately called upon the Christians of Europe to embark upon a crusade to liberate the Holy Land. While contemporary commentators may nitpick aspects of this First Crusade, it's difficult not to admire the Pope's brilliant attempt at reforming the religious and political mess that formed 11th century Europe. Instead of killing each other, Pope Urban II called upon these warmongering bandits to turn their weapons against a real enemy, a common enemy, an enemy to both God and his holy church. The Pope called for a truce of God, under which one would have assurances that their land and property would not be raided or stolen while they were away on crusade, and more importantly, he offered immediate remission of sins for all who should die while undertaking this holy work of crusade. He delivered a rousing speech at Clermont, which excited the many gathered knights, nobles, and bishops to undertake this crusade. While there's no surviving copy of his original speech, there are several written accounts of the speech recorded by contemporaries, including some men who were at the Council of Clermont. Piecing together some fragments from these accounts, Pope Urban II issued a rousing call for crusade. Some of the recorded lines can be summarized into, "Oh, what a disgrace, if such a despised and base race, which worships demons, should conquer a people which has the faith of omnipotent God and is made glorious with the name of Christ. You go around pridefully as knights, but you oppress children, plunder widows, kill and commit sacrilege. Be mindful of your soul, and either lay down your girdle of knighthood or advance as knights of Christ. An accursed race, utterly alienated from God, has invaded the lands of these Christians and has depopulated them by the sword, pillage, torture, and slavery. They have destroyed the churches of God, desecrated others as stables, and defiled altars. Let the deeds of your ancestors who destroyed the kingdoms of the pagans move and incite you to manly achievements." It said after the Pope concluded his speech, the people cried out, "It is the will of God," which in Latin is the famous Crusaders' cry, Deus Vult. Having issued his challenge to the men of Christian Europe to take up arms for the defense of their fellow Christians, the Pope appointed Bishop Adhemar of Puy to lead this crusade. Countless scholarly books and articles have been published on the Crusades, and my goal here isn't to rehash every single aspect of that venture, so I'll simply say the First Crusade was successful in its goal of liberating Jerusalem. But the greater challenge came after the victory. Like anyone who has climbed a mountain, what's one to do after reaching that goal? Well, they climb back down the mountain. And such was the case with the Crusaders, many of whom returned home having filled their crusading vow. The problem, of course, was that Jerusalem was still surrounded by the Turks and needed to be defended, or it would fall right back into the hands of the enemies of God. So in the year 1118, Eudepaeans and 8 companions bound themselves to a perpetual vow under the name of the Poor Knights of the Temple. And they truly were poor knights, living only on alms, and they were of the Temple, since Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, assigned them a portion of his palace adjoining the temple. Hugh traveled back west to seek church approval for this new religious order, as well as recruits. This new religious order, renamed the Knights Templar, adopted the Cistercian way of life, and also adopted the Cistercians' white habit, adding to it a red cross. And to the 3 regular vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, they added a 4th vow of crusading. What many don't realize is these Knights Templar were an actual religious order, just like the Benedictines, Franciscans, or Dominicans. They wore habits, took the monastic vows, recited the Liturgy of the Hours, and had set days of fasting and feasting. Based on the rule of St. Benedict, many religious orders followed a life of ora et labora, prayer and work. This was true of the Knights Templar as well, with the difference being the scope of their work. Instead of plowing fields, making cheese, or copying pages of the scriptures in a scriptorium, their work was to take up the sword in the defense of Christian faith. Ecclesial favors were poured upon this new order. Ultimately, their property was declared free from tithes, and her members were exempted from the jurisdiction of the local bishops, answerable to the Pope alone. Recruits flocked to this new religious order, which was comprised of 4 ranks: the knights, who were the heavy cavalry, the sergeants, or men-at-arms, who were the light cavalry, the casiliers, who managed the temporal administration of the order, and the chaplains, who administered to the spiritual needs of the order. Sometimes there's a popular image of large crusader armies all covered with this white cloth marked with the red cross. But that's not an accurate picture. The regular crusaders were dressed like regular soldiers of the era, and it was only the Templars who fought alongside these regular soldiers who donned this distinctive clothing, which was their religious habit. These red cross-clad Templars were never very numerous compared to the rest of the Crusaders. At their zenith, they had no more than 400 knights in Jerusalem, although their total number would have been a little higher, as most of the Templar combatants were sergeants, as one only became a knight in the order after having proven themselves in battle or by noble birthright. But despite their small numbers, the Knights Templar were a potent fighting force. Famed for their ferocious fighting, they were an inspiration to the regular Crusaders and a terror to the Turks. Some have calculated that nearly 20,000 Templar knights and sergeants died during their 200 years of fighting in the Crusades. This high number of casualties drove a need to continually fill in the ranks of the Templars with new recruits. Unfortunately, pressing new members into service before they could be fully acclimated to the austere Cistercian rule of life led to a general laxity creeping into the order. At their apex in the 13th century, the Knights Templar had accumulated 9,000 manors, which, as warrior monks, were similar to monasteries and abbeys. Each of these manors was autonomous, but contributed all excess revenues to a central treasury of the order. With thousands of Templar institutions depositing funds into a few central locations like Paris and London, the main temples of the order amassed great wealth. And thanks to this wealth and their security as being a church-backed religious order, many of Europe's rulers and nobility turned to these Templars to fulfill their banking needs. But the Templars' great wealth and land holdings stretching across Europe made them an irresistible target for the powerful and greedy. But the Templars were above reproach and answerable to the Pope alone, so one would need an abundance of both political and military power to attempt a scheme against the Templars. And that attempt would come from Philip the Fair, who was especially motivated to bring down the Templars, to whom he was deeply in debt. Officially titled Philip IV, this King of France had been nicknamed the Fair on account of his fair or handsome appearance. If you heard our episode on the history of the Papal Tiara, number 75, you may recall the conflict between King Philip IV and Pope Boniface VII. Boniface had added a second crown to the Papal Tiara as a sign of defiance against this meddlesome king. After the death of Boniface, Philip was able to arrange for the election of a weak pope whom he could control. That man was Pope Clement V, who was even persuaded to move the papacy from Rome to Avignon, where King Philip could more easily control him. With a weak pope in his back pocket, a plot was hatched to take down the Templars. The king sent out secret instructions for his men to arrest the entirety of the Knights Templar throughout France in 1307. The arrest of the Templars took place on Friday the 13th of October, and is often assumed to be the origin of Friday the 13th as being considered a bad or unlucky day. Once arrested, the Templars were charged with 2 offenses: heresy and grave moral sins. As a religious order, the Templar rites of initiation were not conducted in the public eye. Rather, they were a private affair, meaning the king could make up the most egregious claims about these rites, which could not be easily refuted. The arrested Templars were subjected to torture until they confessed to committing heresy and confessed to committing grave sins during these so-called secret initiation rites. To win the people to his side and against the Templar Knights, Philip staged a war against this heresy. He used the false confessions to portray the knights as heretics and propped himself up as a champion of the church by opposing these supposed heretics. The Estates General threw their support with the king, and the University of Paris even bestowed upon him the title of Champion and Defender of the Faith. To win over Pope Clement V with his charade, Philip the Fair used 72 specially selected and coached up Templars to reiterate their false confessions in the presence of the Pope. The ploy worked. Pope Clement V issued a bull in 1307 to have all the Knights Templar arrested across Christendom and their assets seized. Although, it seems the Pope may have been at least a bit skeptical, as he then issued a follow-up bull which voided the French investigation of the Templars and established a papal commission to investigate them. Unfortunately for the Templars, their previous false confessions submitted under torture were accepted as established facts by the papal commission, and any Templars who recanted their false confessions were publicly burned by Philip IV as relapsed heretics. Unsurprisingly, the order was found guilty in France. But outside of France, where the Templars were not threatened with torture or burning, the papal investigations by and large found them innocent. No heretical doctrines or practices could be found, and the commission recommended the order stay intact. This left the Pope with a decision to make: side with the commission, which found the Templars innocent of all charges, or bend to the will of Philip the Fair and condemn the order. That decision came in 1312 when Pope Clement V issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso. In it, the Pope denounced the Templars of falling into the sin of impious apostasy, the abominable vice of idolatry, the deadly crime of the Sodomites, and various heresies. To add insult to injury, the Pope also claimed, "Our dear son in Christ, Philip, the illustrious King of France, was not moved by greed, but was on fire with zeal for the Orthodox faith." But the most important line in the bull was, "Not by definitive sentence, but by apostolic provision, we suppress the Order of the Templars." The king had won, the Templars were destroyed, and their assets seized throughout France. The Pope issued follow-up bulls, which presented a chunk of the Templar holdings to the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, also known as the Hospitallers of St. John and later the Knights of Rhodes, and then the Knights of Malta. While the Templar property in the Iberian Peninsula, where the Reconquista was still underway, was vested to a pair of new military orders, the Order of Montesa, who we mentioned in our episode on Our Lady of Ransom, and in the Order of Christ. Most of the Templars were allowed to either join another military order or return to the secular state, except for the Grand Master of the Templars. A different fate awaited him. Like most of the Templars in France, he had falsely confessed to heresy while under torture. If he stuck with this admission of guilt and repented of his fictional heresy, he would have been freed. But before a public audience in front of Notre Dame Cathedral, the Grand Master rediscovered his courage. Instead of repenting of a heresy he had not committed, he instead proclaimed his innocence and that of the entire order. The Grand Master was then summarily condemned as a relapsed heretic, and by the order of the king, was burned at the stake. And so passed the Knights Templar, only 2 centuries after their founding, although their memory and legacy has survived more than 7 centuries after their suppression, and has been the inspiration for many books, movies, and video games. One way their legacy has lived on is through pop culture, such as inspiring the Jedi Knights of Star Wars as mentioned at the onset of this episode. As one who watched the original 3 Star Wars movies way too many times to count, it's difficult not to notice the similarities between the Knights Templar and the Jedi Knights. Both were devoted to their religious beliefs and practices, both lived ascetical lives, taking the monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, both wore specific habits signifying their order, both used swords. Granted, one group used laser swords, but they used swords nonetheless. In both orders, only the top warriors who proved themselves in battle were promoted to the rank of knight, and both ultimately met their downfall by the scheming of an evil ruler. For the Templars, it was King Philip IV, and for the Jedi, it was the Emperor Palpatine. And in both cases, this ruler sent out a secret dispatch for his soldiers to dispose of the knights. Friday the 13th for the Templars, and Order 66 for the Jedi. I'm sure there are many other connections one could find, if they took the time. And I'm sure the Jedi are not the only modern fictional characters to take their inspiration from the Knights Templar. Just the only one I'm intimately familiar with. But the influence of the Knights Templar reached well beyond modern pop culture and fiction. As the original military order, they inspired the 100 or so military and hospital orders, which followed in their footsteps, including the Teutonic Knights and the Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem. The Templars spent a couple centuries helping the Crusaders make pilgrimages to the Holy Land safer, and many of the orders they inspired played important roles in those and other crusades, such as the famous Battle of Lepanto. While Kevin and I don't have an equivalent of King Philip IV seeking to eliminate us, there's always a chance we could face suppression by the algorithms and bots that use data like ratings and views to decide which podcasts to feature. So, to help prevent Catholic History Trek from being suppressed, we humbly ask that you take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Deus Vult. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto. Sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Catholic History Trek. You can reach us at catholichistorytrek@gmail.com.